You know, people love to talk about monsters like they live under our beds. But the truth is, sometimes the real monsters are the ones who once held you like you were fragile glass. The ones who made you believe you were safe, right before they shattered you with their bare hands. Hi, my name doesn't really matter, because tonight, it's not about who I am. It's about what I became after loving someone who turned my heart into his playground. Before we begin, if you've ever been blamed for something you didn't do, if you've ever been painted as the villain just for walking away from pain, then please, stay with me till the end of this story. Like, subscribe and listen, because what I'm about to share might just remind you how powerful the truth can be when it finally decides to speak. I met him on a rainy afternoon, in a coffee shop that smelled like cinnamon and old secrets. He smiled like he'd known me forever, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I smiled back. There was something about him, something magnetic, intoxicating. He made me feel seen. And for a girl who'd spent most of her life fading quietly into the background, that feeling was almost too beautiful to let go of. We started seeing each other often. Coffee dates turned into late-night calls, and late-night calls turned into promises whispered between half-open lips and sleepy hearts. He told me he'd never felt this way before, and I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to. Because I'd spent so long being the strong one, the quiet one, the one who carried everyone else's storms but never her own. He was my calm, or so I thought. The first time he raised his voice at me, I remember freezing. It wasn't loud, not yet. Just sharp enough to cut through the air, like a warning. He said I made him feel trapped, that I was too emotional, that I read too much into things. And instead of defending myself, I apologized. Because that's what love does to you when you've been conditioned to think that being hurt is part of being loved. But it got worse. The arguments became more frequent, more cruel. He started twisting my words. I'd say one thing, and he'd repeat it back in a way that made me sound manipulative, jealous, insane. And when I cried, he'd laugh. He'd call me dramatic. He'd say, "You love playing the victim, don't you?" And for a while, I believed him. I started questioning myself. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I was the problem. I spent nights staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation, every look, every sigh, trying to find the version of me that used to be loved. But here's the thing about people who gaslight you. They're masters of disguise. They build you up just so they can enjoy the silence when they break you. And he was an artist at that. He painted me as unstable to his friends, needy to his family, toxic to anyone who'd listen. And when I finally walked away, everyone looked at me like I'd just burned down a house that had kept me warm. He told people I cheated, that I lied, that I ruined his peace. And the worst part? They believed him, because he knew how to cry on cue. He knew how to look broken while I stood there, numb, too exhausted to defend myself. For months, I carried that silence like a coffin. People avoided me. My own friends stopped calling. I became the villain in a story I didn't write. And every time I tried to explain, it made me look guiltier, because that's how manipulation works. The more you defend your truth, the more they twist it into proof of your lies. There were nights I wanted to scream. Nights when the weight of his betrayal felt heavier than my own heartbeat. But something inside me whispered, wait for the truth, because truth has a way of surfacing, even when buried under layers of deceit. So, I stayed silent. I worked on myself. I focused on my career, my peace, my little world that didn't need his chaos anymore. And slowly, I started to breathe again. But silence has a strange power. It makes the guilty restless. He started calling again. At first, just to check in, then to apologize. He said he missed me. He said he was going through a lot. And part of me almost fell for it. Because that's what empathy does when you've been conditioned to love your abuser. But this time, I didn't answer. I just watched, and as I did, the mask started to slip. Little by little, people began to see him for who he really was. He repeated the same patterns, the lies, the blame, the drama, with other people. And suddenly, those who once called me the villain started whispering a different story. They saw his truth, the one I'd been living through all along. It took time. But the truth, it always finds its way home. And when it did, He became the monster in his own story. I didn't have to expose him. Life did it for me, and that, perhaps, was the most poetic kind of revenge, to watch him crumble under the weight of his own lies, while I stood quietly, finally free. They say time heals everything, but what they never tell you is, healing doesn't come like a soft sunrise. It comes like a storm. Loud, messy, unforgiving. And when it's over, you look around and realize the person who walked into that storm isn't the one who walked out. After everything he did, I thought I'd never be whole again. I used to wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart racing like I'd just run from something that wasn't even chasing me anymore. But trauma has a way of staying even after the door closes. It lingers. In your breath, in your silence, in the spaces where laughter used to live. For months, I lived quietly. No social media, no phone calls, no new faces. Just me, and the pieces I had left. At first, the silence felt unbearable. Because when you're used to someone else's voice constantly defining who you are, you forget what your own sounds like. But slowly, I started to hear her again. That soft, steady voice that had been buried under years of noise. The one that whispered, "You are not what he said you are." So I started small. I began journaling again. I wrote about my pain, but not like a victim. Like a survivor who was learning to translate her wounds into wisdom. Some days I'd cry so hard I couldn't even see the words. Other days I'd look in the mirror and whisper, "I forgive you," for believing him. And that was the moment the healing began. Forgiveness isn't about them. It's about reclaiming the parts of yourself you handed away in the name of love. It's about saying, "I see the damage, but I refuse to live inside it." Months turned into a year. And by then, I had rebuilt my life from the ashes he left behind. I'd started my own business, something small at first, but it grew faster than I expected. Because when you pour truth into something, it thrives. People could feel the authenticity in my work. They could see the fire in my words, in my designs, in my confidence. I wasn't chasing anyone's validation anymore. I was chasing peace. But peace, I learned, doesn't come quietly either. Because when you finally find it, the people who once thrived on your chaos come knocking again. It started with a message. From him. A simple one. "Hey, I saw your post. You're doing great. I'm proud of you." I stared at the screen for a long time. My hands didn't shake like they used to. My heart didn't race. There was just stillness. The kind of stillness that comes from knowing you no longer owe someone an explanation. I didn't reply. But I won't lie. I thought about it. Not because I missed him, but because I remembered the girl who once would have given anything for that kind of message. A few weeks later, I saw him again. By accident. It was at a friend's event. The kind of gathering I used to avoid because I was afraid of the stares, the whispers. But this time I walked in with my head high. I wore confidence like it was my second skin. And when he saw me, he froze. He looked older somehow. Tired. Like guilt had become his shadow. His smile, that same smile that once charmed me, couldn't reach his eyes anymore. He came over, trying to start a conversation. His tone was soft, hesitant, like he was tiptoeing through the wreckage of his own lies. "You look different," he said, and I smiled. Because I was. I wasn't the girl he broke anymore. I was the woman who learned to rebuild herself without him. He asked if we could talk. Said he wanted to clear the air. But deep down, I knew what he really wanted. Closure that would make him feel better, not me. so I listened. But I didn't offer forgiveness in the way he expected. I didn't tell him it was okay. Because it wasn't. What he did left scars. But those scars became the map that led me back to myself. He said he regretted everything. That he'd lost himself. That he never meant to hurt me. And for a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then I realized his regret didn't come from love. It came from consequence. From watching me become everything he said I couldn't be. The girl he called too emotional was now leading a team. The one he said was too fragile was mentoring others. And the one he painted as the villain was standing there, unshaken, glowing in her truth. I remember the silence that followed after he finished talking. He waited for me to say something, maybe to comfort him. But I just looked at him and said quietly, "You built your story on lies. I built mine on truth. Look at us now." And that broke him more than any anger could have, because he finally saw what I saw all along, that strength isn't loud. It's quiet. It's the peace that comes from not needing revenge, because your success is already proof enough. He left early that night, didn't say goodbye, and as he walked away, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Closure. Not because he gave it to me, but because I gave it to myself. After that night, I kept growing. My business expanded. My voice, the one he tried to silence, became my power. People began inviting me to speak, to share my journey. I wasn't telling my story to hurt anyone. I was telling it to heal others who had lived through the same kind of hell. Every time I stood in front of a crowd, I remembered the girl who cried herself to sleep, believing she was unlovable, and I'd whisper to her, "You made it, but life has a funny way of giving you full circles." One day, I got another message, from one of his friends, the same ones who once turned their backs on me. They said he'd been struggling, that he'd isolated himself, that he kept talking about me, about how he ruined the only person who ever truly loved him. I didn't reply. Not because I was cruel, but because I'd learned that some things are better left unanswered. Because sometimes silence isn't emptiness. It's strength. The truth had finally done what I never could. It revealed the monster behind the mask. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the villain anymore. I felt like the hero of my own story. You know what's strange? Peace doesn't arrive with fireworks. It slips in quietly, in the middle of an ordinary morning, when you realize you haven't thought about the person who once consumed your every breath. That morning came for me one autumn day. I was sitting by my window, coffee in hand, watching the world move softly outside, and for the first time I realized I didn't feel the weight of him anymore. No anger, no sadness, no bitterness, just stillness. I'd built something beautiful out of the ruins he left. A small studio that turned into a company, a voice that reached people who once felt voiceless, and a peace that couldn't be shaken, no matter what ghosts tried to whisper from my past. People often ask me if I ever forgave him, and I tell them, forgiveness isn't about pretending it never happened. It's about saying, I remember everything, but I choose not to carry it. But the world has a way of circling back, doesn't it? Because one afternoon, years later, I got a message I wasn't expecting. It wasn't from him. It was from his sister. She wrote, "He's not doing well. I think you should know." I didn't open it right away. I just stared at the screen for a long time, wondering why my heart didn't react the way it once would have. Curiosity won eventually, and I opened it. Inside was a photo. Him, sitting alone on a park bench, his face tired and unrecognizable. And beneath it, her words. He says he doesn't sleep much. Says his past haunts him, especially what he did to you. I stared at that photo for what felt like hours, not out of pity, but because it was strange to see the man who once stood so tall, now bent under the weight of his own lies. That's the thing about truth. It doesn't shout. It waits. And when it arrives, it strips everything false bare. He had built a version of himself out of my pain, and when that story crumbled, so did he. The same people who once believed him now looked at him with pity, because they had seen me rise. And that's when I understood something powerful. Sometimes revenge isn't about what you do to them. It's about what they have to live with, when you stop being their victim. A few months later, I was invited to speak at a women's conference about resilience, forgiveness, and starting over. When I stepped on stage, I looked around at all the faces in the crowd, some smiling, some tearful, some holding their pain close, the way I once did. I began speaking, not from a script, but from my heart. I told them about the darkness, the gaslighting, the loneliness, about the moment I broke and the moment I rebuilt. And when I finished, the room fell silent. Then slowly people stood up, clapping, crying, holding one another. That moment was the closure I never got from him, because I realized I didn't need him to validate my healing. I had already turned my pain into purpose. Later that evening, as I was leaving, a familiar voice called my name. I turned, and it was him. He looked smaller than I remembered, not physically but spiritually, like life had chipped away at the man who once believed he was untouchable. For a moment, we just stood there, both silent. Then he said quietly, "I saw your speech. You were incredible." There was something trembling in his voice. Regret. Shame. Maybe both. I smiled softly and said, "Thank you." And I meant it, because for the first time those words didn't sting. They didn't carry the ghosts of the past. They were just words, from a man I'd already forgiven long ago in silence. He swallowed hard, looking down, then whispered, "I'm sorry for everything. I ruined the best thing I ever had. I could have said so many things in that moment. I could have reminded him of every lie, every wound, every tear. But instead I said softly, 'No, you didn't ruin it. You just taught me how to build better.'" He blinked, like he didn't understand. But I did, because I had built better, within myself, and that was the last time I saw him. He walked away slowly, shoulders heavy with years of unspoken guilt, and I walked the other way, light as air, because I'd finally realized I didn't need to prove I was the hero. I didn't need to make him the monster. Life had already done that on its own. Now when I think of him, I don't feel hatred. I feel gratitude, because without his betrayal, I would have never found my strength. Without his lies, I wouldn't have discovered my truth. Without being cast as the villain, I would have never learned to write my own ending. And my ending isn't one of revenge, it's one of peace. Sometimes people will paint you in shades that don't belong to you. Let them, because one day the truth will come. And when it does, it will wash away every false color they used to define you. He made me the villain in his story. But in mine, I became everything he feared. Brave, resilient, free. And as I close that chapter for good, I smile and whisper to the girl I once was, "You were never the villain, my love. You were just the lesson he wasn't ready to learn."